I can't fetch latest factual information from the live internet in this chat. What I can do is A, flag the parts of the script that clearly need verification against Reuters/AP official statements, B, correct obvious internal inconsistencies and likely misidentifications using generally established background knowledge up to my cutoff 202508, and C, rewrite the first half in a clean journalist style while preserving the transcript's key verbatim claims in bold quotation marks with the speaker named at the start. Several items in the transcript look especially in need of fact-checking before publication. The claim that Donald Trump declared a 2-week ceasefire with Iran, the assertion it apparently also extends to Lebanon, Pakistan's prime minister being described as a mediator, issuing an everywhere, including Lebanon, statement. The identification of Iran's leader as Mujtaba Khamenei, Iran's top decision maker, is typically the supreme leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. Mujtaba Khamenei is his son and not an official head of state, and place name spellings such as Thai, likely Tyre/Sour, and Al-Kharj, likely Al-Kharj. Treat those as placeholders pending verification. With that caveat, here is part one, approximately 250 words, covering the introduction, hook, and first half of the story in a natural journalist voice and without headings. Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is under intensifying political pressure at home after U.S. President Donald Trump announced what he described as a temporary ceasefire framework with Iran, an announcement that immediately exposed sharp differences between Washington's push to pause the fighting and Israel's insistence that key military objectives remain unfinished. The dispute is playing out publicly in real time and against a backdrop of continued missile launches, air defense interceptions, and cross-border strikes that underscore how fragile any truce would be, even if all sides ultimately sign on. Insight is real. Opponents are seizing on the moment to argue that Netanyahu has been sidelined and that Israel is being asked to stop short at a critical stage. At the same time, Lebanese and regional dynamics have complicated the picture with conflicting claims about whether any pause would apply beyond the Iran-Israel theater. According to the account relayed in Israeli media, Netanyahu had urged caution in private conversations with Trump only days earlier. A senior Israeli official speaking to Channel 12 said Netanyahu warned the U.S. president against agreeing to a ceasefire at what Israel views as a sensitive point in the conflict. The Times of Israel, citing that reporting, said the Israeli leader believed a truce carries significant risks if implemented before Israel's goals are met. The core Israeli concern, as described by officials and echoed across much of the Israeli security establishment in past crises, is that a premature pause can lock in an outcome short of what Israel see onsiders decisive, especially if Iran retains capabilities Israel sees as unacceptable, or if a ceasefire gives Tehran and its allies time to regroup. In this telling, that Netanyahu's warning to Trump was not simply about timing, but about leverage, that Israel's military momentum could be blunted just as pressure was peaking. But Trump, according to the transcript's account, was not persuaded. After being briefed on the possibility of a truce if Iran accepted Washington's demands, Trump proceeded to announce a 2-week ceasefire with Iran. The announcement, the transcript suggests, left Israel with limited room to maneuver diplomatically, particularly given the centrality of U.S. military intelligence and political support. Netanyahu, facing the reality of a U.S.-backed pause, publicly aligned himself with Washington's move, while also drawing bright lines around what Israel would and would not accept. In a series of posts on X, Netanyahu set conditions and framed Israel's position as supportive but conditional, emphasizing that any suspension of strikes must be matched by immediate Iranian steps that address Israeli and U.S. security concerns. In those posts, Netanyahu said Israel supports Trump's decision to suspend strikes against Iran for 2 weeks, but only under strict terms. One of the crucial statements in the transcript is Netanyahu's conditional formulation, asterisk, Netanyahu, Israel supports President Trump's decision to suspend strikes against Iran for 2 weeks, provided Iran immediately reopens the straits and halts all attacks on the U.S., Israel, and other countries in the region. The wording signals an attempt to shape the ceasefire into something closer to a coercive pause, one that demands Iranian concessions up front rather than simply freezing the battlefield. A statement from the Prime Minister's office, as described in the transcript, reinforced that Israel views the dispute through the lens of long-term strategic threats, not merely short-term extra. NGs of fire. It said Israel supports U.S. efforts to ensure that Iran no longer poses a nuclear, missile, or terror threat to the United States, Israel, and regional partners, language that mirrors long-standing Israeli messaging about Iran's capabilities and the networks it backs across the Middle East. Netanyahu also sought to reassure domestic audiences that coordination with Washington remains intact. The transcript says he emphasized that the U.S. has assured Israel it remains committed to shared goals in the upcoming negotiations. That is a key point politically for Netanyahu. He has often presented his relationship with U.S. leadership as a strategic asset, and any hint that Israel is being pressured into an unfavorable deal could carry costs at home. Yet the most immediate and combustible issue was not only Iran, but whether any ceasefire would also cover Lebanon, where Israel has been engaged in repeated strikes and exchanges linked to Hezbollah, the Iran-backed armed group. And political force. Here, the transcript describes a direct contradiction between different public claims. Netanyahu, it says, insisted that any ceasefire with Iran would not automatically extend to Lebanon. One line is repeated as a firm position. Asterisk, Netanyahu, the 2-week ceasefire does not include Lebanon. Asterisk, the message is consistent with Israel's argument that Hezbollah represents a distinct front and that Israel reserves the right to continue operations it says are necessary to prevent attacks from Lebanese territory. But the transcript also describes a competing claim that Pakistan's Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif, portraying Pakistan as a mediator, announced the ceasefire applies everywhere, including Lebanon and elsewhere, and is effective immediately. That assertion, if accurately reported, would be diplomatically significant because it suggests an attempt to widen the scope of a U.S.-Iran understanding into a broader regional de-escalation. It would also immediately with Israel's stated policy of separating the Iran file from the Hezbollah front. The practical reality on the ground, as described, leaned toward Netanyahu's interpretation. Within hours of the ceasefire announcement, Israel carried out multiple strikes in Lebanon, according to the transcript's account. The Times of Israel was cited as reporting that the Israel Defense Forces again warned civilians in a southern coastal city, rendered in the transcript as Ty, likely referring to Tyre/Sour, to evacuate ahead of a strike. The transcript says an Israeli army spokesperson, Colonel Avichai Adre, issued an urgent warning on X, urging residents, particularly in an area identified as Shabria, to leave immediately and instructing displaced residents to move north of the Zerani River. It also says the spokesperson shared a map indicating a building to be targeted. Such warnings, when issued, typically follow a pattern Israel says is meant to reduce civilian casualties, though they also reflect the reality that civilians in southern Lebanon have repeatedly been caught in cycles of evacuation and return as strikes ebb and surge. The transcript notes that much of southern Lebanon was already under a broad evacuation order, an acknowledgement of how extensive displacement has become in areas closest to the border and along likely strike corridors. While Israel's public line was that Lebanon is excluded, the transcript introduces another crucial development. Sources close to Hezbollah told Reuters that the group has halted its fire on northern Israel and Israeli troops in southern Lebanon as part of the U.S.-Iran ceasefire. If accurate, that would suggest Hezbollah is at least temporarily aligning its posture with Tehran's broader calculations, consistent with the idea that Hezbollah's decisions are often influenced by Iran's strategic needs, even when local Lebanese considerations are also at play. The Reuters-sourced detail in the transcript adds that Hezbollah was expected to issue a formal statement outlining its position and responding to Netanyahu's assertion that Lebanon is not included. That sets up a potentially volatile communications battle, Israel insisting it is free to strike in Lebanon, Hezbollah signaling it is observing a pause tied to Iran, and third parties floating the idea that the ceasefire should be region-wide. In such a scenario, a single strike or rocket launch could be framed by either side as a violation, quickly unraveling the arrangement. Inside Israel, the political fallout was immediate. Opposition figures framed the ceasefire not as a diplomatic opportunity, but as a strategic setback and as evidence that Netanyahu is losing control of Israel's most important alliance. The transcript cites former Prime Minister and opposition leader Yair Lapid, who delivered one of the sharpest attacks. His words are presented as a stark condemnation. Lapid, the Trump-announced truce with Iran is a disaster in Israel's history. He also alleged Netanyahu was not directly involved in the negotiations and argued that Israel's stated goals had not been achieved, warning that the damage could take years to repair. The criticism taps into a long-running vulnerability for Netanyahu, the perception that he is uniquely able to manage Israel's relationship with Washington and deliver strategic outcomes. If the public comes to believe that a major U.S. decision was made over Israel's objections, or without Israel at the table, Netanyahu's political rivals will likely treat it as proof that his approach has failed. At the same time, the transcript describes Israeli officials as uneasy and reluctant.